The winter he vanished, the house learned how to hold its breath. Years later, a single envelope appeared where nothing ever waited, its paper yellowed by time and silence. I am a parent living in a small, snowbound town where winters erase footprints and secrets alike. My son disappeared one morning after the last heavy snowfall, leaving behind a room that never quite cooled and questions no one could answer. Life continued in muted tones, jobs, seasons, polite conversations, but the absence settled into every corner like frost. This is the quiet story of waiting, remembering, and the moment when the past finally chose to speak. No wind, no warning. Just a soft white curtain lowering itself over the morning, like the world had decided to speak in whispers. I stood by the front window with my hands wrapped around a mug that had already gone cold. The glass felt numb against my palm. Outside, the street disappeared inch by inch, the familiar turning unfamiliar. Even the trees seemed to lean inward, listening. That was the morning my son did not come back inside. Winter had already overstayed its welcome that year. The days were short and pale, stitched together by routine. Wake up! Make coffee. Listen for footsteps that meant nothing anymore. My son had gone out early. He said he needed air. That was all. He wore his old jacket, the one with the torn cuff and the broken zipper that never quite stayed closed. I remember noticing it on him as he reached for the door. Cold, I said. He smiled, not with his eyes. The door closed gently behind him, too gently. By the time the snow started falling, the jacket was back inside, hanging on the hook by the door, still holding the shape of his shoulders. Still warm, like it hadn't accepted the truth yet. I touched the sleeve, then I pulled my hand away. À count outs, the streetlights blurred into halos. The world grew quiet. The world grew quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt alert. Like the house itself had leaned forward, waiting for something to break the stillness. When noon passed and he didn't return, I told myself it was nothing. Boys wander, time stretches. Snow slows things down, but the quiet kept growing, and somewhere beneath it, something was wrong. By afternoon, the neighbors began to notice. Doors opened, boots pressed into fresh snow. Voices called his name, then faded into the white. Someone knocked, then another. Coats gathered in the hallway. Gloves passed from hand to hand. Note lay ephemeral. There was a lot of standing around at first, people shifting their weight, looking at the sky, saying the same things in different ways. He probably went further than he thought. Snow can disorient you. He'll turn up. The words floated, light and hopeful, but they didn't land anywhere solid. We searched the roads first. The main stretch, then the side streets. Tire tracks vanished almost as soon as we followed them. Footprints filled in behind us like they'd never been there. The woods came next. Dark lines of trees swallowed by white, branches heavy with snow, bowing under its weight. Every sound felt muffled. Our steps, our breathing, even our fear. Someone shouted his name. And the sound didn't come back. Hours passed that way, moving, stopping, listening. I remember the way my breath caught every time I saw something dark in the snow. A glove. A shadow. A trick of the light, but it was never him. As night fell, the search grew slower. Lanterns flickered. Flashlights cut thin tunnels through the dark. The snow kept falling, patient and thorough, covering whatever answers might have been there. When they finally told me we should stop for the night, I nodded. I don't remember agreeing. I just remember standing still while everyone else turned away. The days that followed blurred together. Snowdrifts climbed higher along the fence. The search expanded, then stalled. Dogs were brought in. Maps were spread across tables. Fingers traced routes that led nowhere. People spoke softly around me, like I might shatter if they used their normal voices. They asked questions. When did I last see him? Was he upset? Did he say anything strange? I searched my memory until it felt thin as ice, every word replayed, every pause. Every look I had chosen not to examine too closely at the time, theories began to surface. Some kind, some cruel, some whispered when they thought I couldn't hear, ran away, got lost, didn't want to be found. Each one landed heavier than the last. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. The pipes knocked. The floor creaked like it remembered him. Every sound felt like it might be the moment he came back. But the door stayed closed. When spring finally arrived, it came quietly. Snow softened, ice broke apart. The ground reappeared in patches, dark and wet, like something exposed too soon. They searched again. And again there was nothing. No jacket, no trail, no ending. The snow left, the silence did not. The jacket stayed on its hook long after the season changed. I couldn't bring myself to move it. It felt like a promise I didn't know how to keep. Outside, life resumed. Lawns turned green, birds returned. People stopped asking how I was doing and started telling me how strong I must be. But inside the house, winter lingered. Some losses melt away with time. Others sink into the walls. Even now, I sometimes stand by the door and imagine the snow falling again, thick and soundless, covering everything except the space where he should have been. And I wonder, when the cold leaves, what is it that stays? The house learned the change before I did. It started with the sounds, or maybe the absence of them. At night, the walls didn't settle the same way. The heater clicked on and off, too loud in the quiet. The clock in the kitchen sounded like it had learned to speak up. I would lie in bed, eyes open, counting each second as if it were something I could hold. Somewhere between midnight and morning, the house stopped waiting for him. And I was the only one who hadn't noticed yet. Days passed without shape. Morning came whether I was ready or not. Light slid across the floor in slow, patient lines. I drank coffee that tasted like nothing. I folded laundry that didn't belong to anyone anymore. The house adjusted. That's the part no one tells you, how quickly a place can relearn itself. His shoes stayed by the door for a while. I stepped around them careful, like they were fragile. Eventually, I moved them to the closet, not because I was ready. Just because I needed the door to close all the way, rooms went unused. The chair at the table stayed empty. The hallway lights stayed off. Dust began to gather in corners I used to clean without thinking. It settled gently, like a second snowfall, quiet, persistent, impossible to stop once it began. I avoided his bedroom. I told myself it was practical. It was not. The door stayed closed. Sometimes I would stand in the hallway and look at it, my hand hovering just short of the knob. The wood looked darker there, worn from years of opening and closing, from knowing him. I didn't trust what might happen if I went inside. I didn't trust myself to come back out the same. Nights were the hardest. The dark rearranged everything. I would hear the house breathe, pipes shifting, the roof cooling, the faint tick of something expanding, then settling again. Each sound arrived with a question attached. Was that him? Did I imagine it? Should I check? Once, just after midnight, I heard something that sounded like a step. Slow. Careful. The kind he used to take when he thought I was asleep. Ennad wamash. I sat up in bed, heart moving faster than my thoughts. The silence that followed felt deliberate, almost cruel. I waited. Kane. Nothing came. Friends started calling more often, then less. They used gentle voices, as if volume might make it worse. They brought casseroles I didn't eat. They sat at my table and spoke about ordinary things, pausing too long between sentences. You have to keep going, one of them said, staring into her cup. Another nodded. You can't stop your life. I watched their hands as they spoke, how they folded napkins, how they picked at crumbs. No one looked at the empty chair. Moving on, they called it. Canny. As if grief were something you could pack away once it had overstayed its welcome. After they left, the house felt even quieter, like it resented the interruption. One afternoon, the sunlight shifted just enough to reach his bedroom door. The handle caught the light, bright and unforgiving. I don't remember deciding to open it. I only remember the sound it made when I did. The door creaked. Like it remembered, the room smelled the same. That was the first thing that hurt. Clean laundry, old books. Something faintly metallic, like winter air trapped indoors. Dust lay thick on the dresser, softening the edges of everything. His bed was still made, the blanket folded the way he liked it, corner tucked, no wrinkles. Time had stopped there. I stood in the doorway, afraid to step inside. The floor looked colder than the rest of the house. On his desk, a notebook lay open. The pen beside it had rolled slightly, as if nudged by a breeze that never came. I didn't touch it. Some things felt too much like evidence. I realized then that the house wasn't quiet because he was gone. It was quiet because it was listening to me now, waiting to see what I would do with the space he left behind. I closed the door again softly. Not in retreat, just gently. That night I left the hallway light on, a small thing. But the darkness didn't feel quite as heavy. Time kept moving. I didn't ask it to. It did so anyway. Days stacked themselves on top of each other, uneven and indifferent. Living inside a question changes you. It teaches you how to carry weight without showing it. How to wake up without answers and still make the bed. Somewhere in the house, dust continued to fall. Silence continued to settle, and I learned, slowly, unwillingly, that moving forward doesn't mean leaving someone behind. Sometimes it just means learning how to live with the door still closed and the answer still missing. Heck, by the time the paint on the old bakery sign was replaced, I understood something had shifted. Not all at once, not loudly, just quietly, like a chair moved an inch to the left. I stood across the street and watched them bolt the new sign into place. Brighter colors, cleaner letters. A name no one had to remember. Cars passed, someone laughed, the wind lifted a wrapper along the curb. The town looked the same, but it wasn't holding its breath anymore, only I was. Years have a way of arriving without asking. They come folded into ordinary days, trash nights, grocery lists, bills, paid on time. I stopped counting them somewhere along the way. Counting made it feel too official. The town kept changing in small, polite ways. New mailboxes appeared. Old fences came down. The hardware store repainted its windows every spring. New families moved in. I could tell by the unfamiliar cars and the way children ran through yards like they owned the future. Their parents waved when they saw me, smiling the way people do when they don't know your story. They didn't know my son's name, and there was no reason they should. At the market, at Heat House. At the market, the cashier asked how my day was going. At the post office, they commented on the weather. Conversation stayed light, careful. People still recognized me. They just didn't linger anymore. How are you holding up? Became Marav to make up to Same McKang. Good to see you. I nodded. I smiled back. I learned how to keep my answers short enough to be acceptable. Pain, when it lasts too long, becomes awkward. It makes people shift their weight, look at their watches, so I learned to carry it quietly. The festivals came back first. That's how I noticed time had moved on without me. The autumn fair. The autumn fair returned to the park with its paper lanterns and food stalls. Music drifted through the air, uneven and cheerful. I walked past it slowly, hands in my coat pockets, watching children line up for rides. My son once begged to try. A woman I barely recognized waved. Her hair was different. Mine probably was too. Beautiful evening, she said. I agreed. It was. Winter brought the lights. Strings of them wrapped around lampposts, blinking patiently against the dark. Carolers gathered outside the town hall. Someone offered me cocoa. I took it, held it, didn't drink. Every season carried him with it. Not in the way people talk about memories, but in the quiet math of absence. One more chair missing. One less voice in the crowd. By spring, the town hosted a small parade. New families clapped. Old ones smiled, like it was a tradition that had never been interrupted. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, hands folded, listening to applause roll past me like water around a stone. No one asked where my son was anymore. The question had aged out. I could have followed. One afternoon, I overheard two teenagers talking outside the grocery store. They were laughing, leaning against bikes, arguing about something that didn't matter. One of them pointed toward the woods at the edge of town. Man, my dad says someone got lost out there years ago, he said. The other shrugged. Probably just a story. They rode off before I could move. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the place where my life had split open. The woods looked smaller now, less threatening, like they'd been forgiven. That was when I understood it. My son hadn't disappeared from the town. He had disappeared into it. His story had thinned with time, diluted into rumor, into maybe. Into once. I was the only one still holding the full weight of him, the sound of his steps, The way he leaned in doorways, the way he never finished a glass of water. Grief doesn't fade evenly, it fades outward. Until one day, you're the only one still bleeding, and no one can see the wound. That evening, I walked home as the streetlights flickered on. Windows glowed with dinner and television and ordinary life. Somewhere, someone was learning a neighbor's name for the first time. I unlocked my door and stepped inside. The house greeted me the way it always did, quiet, familiar, untrained outside. The town kept moving. Das Permicide. Inside, time moved differently. I set my keys down, hung my coat, paused in the hallway longer than necessary. There are losses that become invisible, not because they are gone, but because they belong to only one person now. And as the seasons continued without asking permission, I learned this truth slowly. When the world moves on, Kite, you don't stop hurting. You just learn how to hurt alone. The first snow came early that year. Soft flakes fell in silence, thick enough to blur the edges of the world. I pressed my palm against the cold glass of the window and watched it gather along the sill, along the roof, along the narrow paths that led nowhere and everywhere at once. The house felt smaller and colder, even though the radiator was working. Somewhere outside, a branch scraped against the siding. It sounded like a footstep. Winter always returned with a sharpness I could never prepare for. The air smelled different, icy and dry, carrying the faint trace of wood smoke from distant chimneys. My breath fogged the windows as I poured a cup of coffee I wouldn't drink. The streets were empty early in the morning, and I found myself walking them like I used to, retracing paths my son once took. I would follow the sidewalks, step over the cracks he tripped on, pause at corners where he liked to look both ways before crossing. I imagined him there, in the quiet, waiting, not moving, just standing, waiting. The world around me seemed unchanged. Houses dressed in snow, streetlights glowing faintly through the white haze. But I felt every step differently. He had been missing so long that even familiar places carried new weight, Warham Palmate, as if the memory of him had folded itself into every surface. Kello Hefchibus Tafta. I tried to remember the sound of his voice, but it was already fraying at the edges, slipping through my fingers like smoke. And yet, some part of me walked in hope. That repetition, those familiar paths, might be enough to call him back. By mid-morning, I was following the small trail along the riverbank where the ice had begun forming in thin, jagged sheets. The ground crunched under my boots. The sound startled me at first, as if the snow had been holding its breath for weeks, and now it had finally let it out. And I saw the footprints from days before, mine mostly. Sometimes a neighbor's dog had wandered through, leaving a confused pattern that reminded me of him. Not real, but enough to stir the ache. I lingered at the bridge where he once liked to watch the water flow. I pressed my hand against the cold railing, imagining him leaning there, the wind in his hair. At home, the phone rang. I didn't answer. No one could call what I was hoping to hear, not anymore. The house waited in my absence, quiet except for the clock ticking and the radiator's occasional hum. I removed my gloves, and the warmth of my hands didn't return immediately. Every little ache, frozen fingers, stiff shoulders, felt like a signal, a reminder that I was still here, still searching. Kang. By evening, I dreamed of him. In the dreams, we spoke but never finished the conversation. He left mid-sentence, or I did. Snow fell in slow motion around us, muffling the words we couldn't catch. The dreams carried the weight of everything I hadn't said, and everything I hadn't dared to ask. Late one night, I found myself standing at the door again, the same one he used to leave through. My hand hovered above the knob. I remembered the way it had felt in his grip, warm and familiar, and how quickly he could disappear into the cold without a backward glance. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and stepped outside. Once, the snow crunched under my boots, sharp against the hush of the night. The street was empty. The lampposts painted long lines of gold across the white ground. I followed the trail, imagining he was just ahead, waiting for me to notice. I walked past the park where we once played, past the corner store where he bought candy he didn't need, past the alley where he once ran faster than I could catch. The world was still, and in that stillness I realized something I had tried to ignore. The past doesn't hide under the snow to be found. It settles there. It waits. And sometimes it is enough just to walk through it, step by step, to feel him near again. I stopped at the edge of the river, where the ice glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The reflection of the street lamps danced like tiny stars, broken and shifting, and for a moment I swore I could see him in the water. Not moving, just looking back, the ache inside me sharpened. Not pain, not relief, just recognition. I returned home, when my boots were soaked and my cheeks numb. The door creaked like it remembered, welcoming me back to the house that never quite recovered from his absence. So, I hung my coat, removed the snow, and leaned against the wall for a moment, listening. Outside, the snow continued its quiet descent, the world softened under its weight. I sat by the window watching the flakes drift down, thinking about all the things left unsaid. About all the times I had retraced the paths waiting. Maybe the past isn't lost. Maybe it's just waiting beneath the snow, patient, silent, and still. And when morning comes again, I will step outside and walk step by step, looking for him in the spaces he left behind. The snow had stopped falling the night before, leaving the world muted and still. I opened the front door to let in the cold morning air, and there it was, an envelope. Reckoning, resting on the porch like it had always been meant to be found. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, written in a handwriting I almost recognized. The ink had faded, uneven, the lines trembling slightly, as if the paper itself had been holding its breath. I stood there, frozen, the wind lifting the edge of the envelope like it was testing me. And I didn't move. Years had passed since the snow first covered the streets, since my son vanished and the town slowly learned to look away. Seasons had changed, new people had arrived, and yet the house had not forgotten him. I carried my routines like armor: coffee at 6, check the mail, sweep the porch, stare out at the street. But I never arrived anymore. Bills, catalogs, letters from distant friends, but nothing that made my hands pause, nothing that made my heart catch like it did that morning. The envelope looked fragile in the pale light, thin, almost translucent. The paper felt like it had been rescued from time, and the or maybe from someplace I wasn't allowed to reach before. I traced the edge with my fingertip, careful not to disturb it. Something inside me tightened, a memory, a warning, a hope. I remembered his jacket on the hook by the door, his shoes by the stairs, the way he once leaned against the frame, smiling, not with his eyes. And now this, I wanted to pick it up, but I was afraid of what opening it might undo. Afraid of what it might finally reveal, I stepped back inside, the door closing with a soft click. The house exhaled behind me, settling again. Carried the envelope to the table, setting it gently on the edge as if it might slip through reality itself. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee left on the counter overnight. A window rattled in the wind. The radiator hummed low, steady, indifferent. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow deeper than it should have been. I ran my fingers along the envelope again, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of the handwriting. I recognized the loops, the slant, so familiar, so impossibly familiar. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run. I did none of those things. Instead, I sat. I stared at the envelope, memorizing the letters of my own name, as if seeing them could anchor me to what was real. My hands shook, my breath caught. I imagined the paper opening itself, revealing truths I wasn't ready to carry. A memory flickered. Him at the breakfast table, staring out the window, waiting for something he didn't name. I could almost hear his voice, almost. The envelope did not move. It waited, patient, silent. I was not sure I could wait any longer. Finally, I lifted it. Fingers trembling, I traced the seal, hesitated, then slowly broke it. The paper resisted at first, brittle under my touch, edges crumbling slightly. I held it closer, careful, afraid to spill what it might contain. Inside, a single sheet of paper. A note. Clean, folded precisely, ink faded but legible. I could not read it at first. My eyes skimmed the lines, heart hammering. The room narrowing until nothing existed but the words and the space between them. Caddict. He was alive, not physically, not in the way I could hold him, but alive in thought, in memory, in the careful handwriting I knew before it became distant, fragile, almost gone. Out, the note spoke softly, like a whisper I had been waiting decades to hear. It spoke of winter, of waiting, of mistakes made, and paths taken. I felt each word, slow, deliberate, pressing against my chest like a hand I couldn't refuse. I realized something I had not allowed myself to see before. Time does not erase connection. Even years apart, even silence, even absence, and still I trembled, unsure whether this knowledge was relief or the start of another ache. I stepped back from the table. The envelope lay open, its edges curling slightly from the winter air. I did not touch it again. I only looked. Out outside, the wind stirred the bare branches against the gray sky. Snow threatened again, loose and patient. The porch was quiet, untouched, waiting for the next decision. I did not know why it had arrived now. After all this time, I only knew that it had come. That it demanded attention, that it changed everything and nothing at all. I sat with it, breathing slowly, listening to the house settle around me. Time had returned, fragile and deliberate, like the paper in my hands. And I wondered, quietly, what else was waiting to be found. The envelope sat on the table like it had been waiting for me all morning. Sunlight cut across the paper in a sharp line, illuminating the faded ink. I hesitated, fingers hovering above it. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the radiator. The walls held their usual silence, but the air felt heavier than usual, patient, as if holding its breath for what I was about to discover. I traced the edge of the paper, careful not to disturb it. The handwriting, his handwriting, made my chest tighten. I had seen it 1,000 times before, on notebooks, on receipts, on scraps of paper folded into jackets. But now, years later, it carried the weight of absence. I opened the envelope slowly, and the words met me. The paper was thin, almost fragile, the kind you imagine might tear if touched too roughly. I held it gently in both hands, afraid to crease it, afraid to rush what might be my only connection left to him. The letter began simply, with his familiar greeting. His words were careful, deliberate, precise, the way he always spoke when he wanted to be heard clearly. Nothing rushed. Nothing wasted. I sat at the table, letting the sunlight warm my hands, letting the quiet fill the room around me. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, scattering dry leaves across the yard. The world continued, indifferent. But inside, time slowed. I could almost hear him speaking as I read. Not the voice of a child, not the boy who had vanished into winter, but someone older, measured, shaped by distance and choice. The ink did not blur, the words did not run. And yet each line seemed to pulse beneath my fingertips, alive with memory. I read the first few lines twice. Then a third time I was afraid that if I hurried, the connection might vanish. That the letters would crumble like the snow underfoot, leaving me empty-handed again. He wrote of winter, of long nights and shorter days, of landscapes frozen in thought, mirrored in his own stillness. Every sentence felt like a path I had walked before, yet one I had never fully understood. I estes ashamed Danning claying. He spoke of distance, not just the miles between us, but the distance of time, of choices, of words left unspoken. I could feel the careful shaping of each phrase, the way he had paused between them, imagining my eyes reading them slowly, absorbing each pause. At one point he mentioned silence, the kind that speaks louder than words, the kind that leaves room for regret, for hope, for what cannot be said. I held the paper closer, tracing the loops of his letters with my finger, memorizing the curves that used to feel so familiar. I wanted to read faster, to devour the message in one breath, but I could not. The handwriting demanded patience. And as I read, I realized that every line carried a weight I had not expected, not a plea, not an explanation, just presence. Somewhere between the sentences, I felt him reach across years to sit beside me at the table. Older, quieter, still the same boy I had lost. The letter paused on choices. He wrote of roads taken and roads ignored, of the silence of decisions and the small consequences that gather over time. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to imagine the life that had allowed him to write this, careful, deliberate, untouched by the chaos of my grief. And what kind of life leaves room for this kind of goodbye? The question pressed against my chest, steady and relentless. The paper trembled under my hands. I could almost feel the pen still warm from his touch, the slow movements of ink across the page. There was no anger, no accusation, no explanation that demanded forgiveness, just him, present. In a way I had not dared to hope for after so many years, I opened my eyes. The sunlight had shifted. Dust motes floated lazily through the air. The words on the paper had not changed, but I had. I realized then that the letter was not just a goodbye, it was a bridge. A single, fragile thread reaching across the years, waiting for me to take hold. I folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. My hands were steady now, but my chest ached in ways I could not name. The room was silent again. The wind outside whispered through the bare trees, scratching at the window pane, echoing the tremor in my thoughts. I set the envelope aside, knowing I would return to it, I would read it again. I would memorize the handwriting until it became part of the air I breathed. And for the first time in years, the absence did not feel entirely empty. Somewhere, beneath the weight of winter, of time, of loss, there was connection. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, this fragile piece of paper held more than words. It held a life. A presence, a voice that had waited for me across the years. I sat quietly, listening to the house settle around me, feeling the weight of what had been lost, and the strange, delicate weight of what had returned. And I wondered, softly, what other echoes might still be waiting. The morning light fell in thin stripes across the table, illuminating the letter in uneven bands. I leaned over it, tracing the folds, the faint creases where it had been handled before. The ink, though faded, held him, each stroke deliberate, careful, as if he had measured his presence onto the page. I did not read it once. I sat there, listening to the house settle around me. The radiator clicked. A floorboard sighed. Somewhere outside, wind rattled a loose shutter. The world waited quietly, giving me permission to open the truth. One line at a time, I breathed slowly. Then I began. The letter was not like the others. It did not reach across time with vague nostalgia or soft regret. It reached with specificity, careful and measured. He wrote of feeling trapped, not by people, not by circumstance, but by the quiet weight of expectations he never understood how to name. Words I had longed to hear, excuses I had never imagined. I read slowly, afraid of letting the ink run, afraid that if I hurried, the meaning might shatter. His handwriting, so familiar, carried the cadence of his voice, now older, more reserved. I paused often, letting each sentence settle like ash in my hands. Some lines burned softly, some weighed heavily, pressing down like snow on a roof. Outside, the day moved on. Neighbors passed by with errands, the wind lifted scraps of leaves along the street. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, of old wood, of winter waiting to descend again. I wondered, quietly, is understanding the same as healing? The thought lingered in the air, heavy and insistent, as I turned the page. He wrote of leaving, not suddenly, not in a moment of anger or fear, but in quiet, careful increments. Each departure measured, each step deliberate. He spoke of mornings when he lingered by the window, saw afternoons spent walking the same streets he once walked with me, thinking without words, without interruption. I could see him in the lines, the small moments of hesitation, the long pauses between decisions. He did not justify himself. He did not ask me to forgive. I am sorry, he wrote, short, honest, resigned, kanged. The words carried weight far beyond their length. I folded the letter slightly, pressed it to my chest, then let it rest again. The room felt smaller, as though holding this confession had altered its shape. I thought of all the questions I had rehearsed over years. Where were you? Why did you leave? Did you think of me? Some answers came, not all. The silence between his sentences was as loud as the words themselves. I paused again, letting the ash of meaning settle. My fingers traced the loops and curves of his handwriting, memorizing them the way I had memorized the curve of his smile, the tilt of his head. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of a distant dog barking. sharp and lonely, like a memory of a day long gone. And then I realized something I had been avoiding: understanding does not erase absence. Knowing why someone left, even in careful detail, does not fill the space they once occupied. I read the lines again, his apologies, the soft confessions of fear and confusion, of choices made in silence. Each word carried him closer. Each word also reminded me of the distance that had grown between us. The ash settled. I felt the weight of time pressing down. The weight of years spent imagining him in empty rooms, in forgotten corners of the house, in streets that had no memory of his laughter. He had left pieces behind. Not the whole picture, and perhaps he never could. Yeah. I set the letter down, hands trembling slightly, and listened. The house held its breath with me. The radiator hummed. The floor creaked. Outside, the trees shivered in the wind, brushing against the windows like quiet reminders. I understood. And yet the ache remained, because understanding is not the same as closure. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. The handwriting stared up at me, patient and unyielding. I moved to the window and looked out at the gray afternoon, watching the clouds shift over rooftops and empty streets. The wind lifted the leaves, carrying them in lazy arcs, indifferent to the weight of my thoughts. I touched the envelope one last time, fingers lingering, feeling the texture of the paper, the imprint of him. The house was quiet, the world continued outside, and I was left with the residue of his words, the careful truth, the unspoken moments, the weight of what he never said. I breathed slowly, listening to the silence settle like snow around me, and wondered, if some absences are never meant to be filled, what is left for those who remain? I turned back to the kitchen table. The letter waited, patient, fragile, and I knew I would return. Or account, because some truths, even partial, demand attention, even when they do not heal. The morning light fell gray and thin through the curtains, pooling on the table where the envelope rested. I traced its edges with my fingertip, careful not to disturb the creases, careful not to hurry what had already waited years to arrive. Out outside, the wind moved through bare branches, scratching the window pane in a rhythm that reminded me of old footsteps in the hall. Familiar, absent, insistent. I opened the envelope again. The letter inside smelled faintly of paper and ink, fragile as frost. I lifted it slowly, the words staring up at me like they had always been meant for my eyes. And for a moment I did not read, I only breathed. The house listened with me. For days I sat with it. The letter never left my side. I carried it from table to armchair, unfolded it in the kitchen light, then on the couch, where the afternoon sun softened the edges of everything. Defaust a per thing. The lines he wrote became landmarks. Each pause, each careful word demanded attention. Relief came in whispers, relief that he had planned, that he had not been swept away entirely by chaos. Grief pressed just as heavily, the weight of years spent imagining him lost, cold, unreachable. To Kemet, I realized how little I had known of him. His inner life, the quiet fears and careful choices, had been hidden, even from me. Stories I had imagined, the rumors that had slipped through the town like wind through trees, they all seemed exaggerated, almost theatrical, once measured against this truth. The truth, I learned, was smaller but heavier, not the drama I had expected, not the explanations I demanded. Just him, real and human, leaving a trace of himself in lines of ink. I reread a sentence slowly, letting it sink, a pause here, a fold there. His voice was unmistakable, older, patient, deliberate, and achingly familiar. I moved through the house differently. Each room carried its own memory of him. His jacket still hung in the hall closet. Dust had settled along the edges. His shoes rested neatly where he left them, as if waiting. The letter made the silence heavier. I read aloud softly, not words exactly, but the cadence, the spaces between sentences, like a pactai stun steps, letting it roll over me like a tide. My fingers trembled across the relief and grief tangled in my chest, neither one willing to give the other space. Neighbors passed, eyes polite, voices quiet. The town had carried on. Children played where he might have been. New faces wandered streets he once knew. The gossip, once sharp and cutting, felt hollow now. Without him here to embody their theories, the rumors dissolved into air, stripped of drama and blame. Kat, I realized how many assumptions I had lived with. How many questions I had asked myself in the dark, imagining motives, errors, missteps. The letter offered clarity, yes, but it also offered weight, because understanding does not always bring peace. I held the paper to my chest, the folds pressed lightly against my collarbone, a small, fragile anchor. And I asked myself quietly, what do we do with answers that arrive too late? I stood by the window, looking out at the street he once walked. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, deliberate, muffling sound. My reflection stared back at me, fragmented across the glass. The weight of knowing pressed down. It was smaller than I had imagined, no dramatic confessions, no revelation to shatter a life, but heavier. Each word, each sentence carried gravity. It had been years of absence, years of imagining, years of partial truths. Now the truth rested in my hands. I ran my fingers over the handwriting. Loops, curves, the subtle tilt of letters he had once used so naturally. I could almost hear him speaking in the spaces between words, deliberate, careful, not asking for forgiveness, not demanding understanding. Just existing quietly in the way that life often does, messy, partial, human. I thought of the moments lost, birthdays, quiet afternoons, conversations that never happened. The absence of drama did not lessen the ache. If anything, it sharpened it, cutting straight to the space left behind. Onderrekang. The letter felt like both a gift and a weight. Relief was present, but I could not untangle it from the grief. Understanding did not mean closure. I folded the letter again gently, as if the act of folding could contain the years between us. I placed it back in its envelope and set it on the table where morning light would find it again. The wind lifted the bare branches outside, brushing against the windows in quiet insistence. Snow fell steadily, muffling the world. I sat in the armchair, listening to the house breathe with me. Time continued outside, indifferent, patient, unhurried. Inside, I held both relief and grief, learning to carry them together, as if that were the only proper way to honor the truth. I looked at the envelope one last time that evening. It waited quietly. Patient, fragile. And I realized the letter had given me something I had not expected, not closure, not answers fully satisfying, but presence. The weight of truth is not always what we imagine. It is the slow settling of understanding, the quiet acknowledgement of what was, what is, and what will never be. I took a breath. The snow continued to fall, and I knew I would return to the envelope again. Because some truths, no matter how late, demand to be felt fully. The snow had begun again, light at first, like dust across the yard, then heavier, settling in silent layers over the street. I held the envelope in my hands, tracing the familiar curves of his handwriting with a fingertip. No return address. No indication of where he might be, or if he even wanted a reply. I lingered at the table, listening to the house around me, the radiator humming low, the floor creaking under its own memory. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of leaves scratching along the porch. I wondered if writing back would matter at all, or if the act itself was enough. And then slowly, I decided it might be. For days, I had carried the letter in my pocket, rereading his words in fragments, memorizing the lines like a prayer. His absence had taught me patience, but now my own presence demanded expression. I sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen, staring at a blank page. Each word felt heavy, charged. I wanted to write something that would reach him, or at least reach the part of myself that had been holding him in memory. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's fire. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily past the window. I imagined the letter traveling through similar quiet streets, unnoticed, unremarkable, yet carrying intention. The words came slowly, measured, awkward, but sincere. I wrote about the quiet I had carried, about the waiting, the absence, the mornings that felt too long, about the grief that never left, and the relief of finally hearing his voice again, even on paper. Folded the note carefully. It felt ceremonial, an acknowledgment of what had been lost, what had been found, and what could never return to the way it had been. I dressed for the walk, bundling against the sharp winter air. The envelope rested in my coat pocket, pressed against my heart. Each step on the snow-covered street seemed deliberate, symbolic. The crunch of my boots felt louder than usual, as though the world were amplifying the small ceremony of my decision. At the post office, I paused. The building smelled faintly of paper and ink, the low murmur of voices echoing in the cold, high-ceilinged space. I held the envelope in both hands, turning it gently, imagining him on the other side, somewhere, maybe waiting, maybe not. There was no line to wait in, no clerk to notice the trembling of my fingers. I placed the letter in the box slowly, ceremonially, like casting a small stone into a frozen pond. The act itself seemed to matter more than the destination. Outside again, the wind bit at my cheeks. I watched the snow swirl and settle on the street, covering footprints I had just made. My hands still tingled from the cold. My chest felt both lighter and heavier at once. The world continued, indifferent, patient. I had released my words, even if they would never reach him. Walking home, I realized something quietly unsettling. Release is not always about the other person. Sometimes it is about giving voice to your own silence. I thought of all the mornings I had waited, all the nights I had imagined him returning through the snow or the dark, all the rumors and half-truths I had carried like weights in my pocket. The act of writing, folding, sending, simple, deliberate, solitary, was a bridge to a part of myself that had remained frozen in time. The letter might never reach him. I did not know where he was, if he was still alive, or if he had ever wanted to hear from me. And yet, the gesture had transformed something inside me. It was no longer a question of answers or responses. It was acknowledged. It was conversation across absence. I felt my shoulders loosen slightly. The chill in my hands remained, but the heaviness in my chest began to shift, subtly, imperceptibly. I realized that sometimes the act itself is the point. Sometimes release is not a gift to someone else. It is a gift to yourself. Back at home, I set the kettle on the stove. Steam rose in slow, lazy spirals, fogging the window panes. I traced a finger along the frost forming at the edges, watching the patterns shift like memory. The letter was gone, but its presence lingered. A quiet, gentle pulse echoing in the room, in my chest, in the rhythm of snow against the window. I sat in the armchair, hands wrapped around a warm mug, listening to the house breathe. Outside, the street lay white and unbroken, footprints fading into memory. I thought of him. Somewhere, perhaps, he existed still. Somewhere, perhaps, he remembered, and I understood, release is not always witnessed, not always reciprocated. Sometimes it is a quiet act done alone, in snow and silence, in the simple acknowledgement that words finally spoken are enough. I closed my eyes. The snow continued to fall. And for the first time in years, I felt the world a little less heavy. The silence returned, not empty, but alive, carrying something I could finally set down. The snow had begun to retreat in thin, hesitant strips, revealing the brown, damp earth beneath. Yucca icicles clung to the eaves, dripping slowly, one by one, in a rhythm that filled the quiet morning. I stood at the threshold of his room, hand on the doorknob, feeling the weight of years folded into a single, fragile moment. Sunlight spilled unevenly across the floorboards, dust motes dancing in the golden streaks. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric, mixed with the faint tang of winter thawing. I hesitated, listening to the house breathe, imagining him somewhere in the sun-drenched silence of memory. And then I opened the door. The room had been untouched for years. The bed was made neatly. The blanket faded in the sun that rarely reached it. Books lay stacked where he had left them, some leaning, some upright, holding ghosts in their spines. I inhaled slowly, letting the air fill the corners, brushing away the stale quiet that had gathered like dust. The smell of paper, wood polish, and faint winter cold mingled in my lungs. I did not rush. I traced my fingers over the edges of the furniture, lightly, as if touching might awaken him from memory. Some objects carried his presence, his jacket draped over a chair, a notebook with pages curled from time. Others felt like fragments I could release, a pair of shoes, a toy, A small framed photograph I had been holding onto longer than I realized. I opened the window just enough to let in the spring air, the sound of the town stirring outside. Birds moved along the rooftops, their wings scraping gently against shingles. I listened, quietly, letting the world enter. And I wondered, can acceptance be a form of peace? I began sorting. Not hurriedly, not with a sense of finality, but deliberately, gently, like tending a garden that had lain fallow for years. Some things I picked up and held close, a notebook, its pages faintly marked with his handwriting, a small hat he had left behind, folded with care. Other things I set aside quietly, allowing them to leave my hands without guilt. The act felt symbolic, an acknowledgement of memory and of moving forward. Each object I touched carried a story, a fragment of him, a shadow of the life that had slipped past us. Sunlight shifted across the floor, pooling on objects I had long avoided, bathing them in warmth. Dust rose in soft motes, floating in lazy arcs, catching in the light like fleeting memories. The house seemed different, not healed, but changed. Walls that had once pressed close with quiet absence now felt like witnesses, observing the slow thaw of time. Gah! I paused in the middle of the room, looking at the floorboards, the scattered traces of his presence. The air felt lighter, but not empty. There was space for grief, for memory, for relief, all coexisting in delicate balance. I sat on the edge of his bed, holding a notebook in my hands, its cover worn, edges softened from years of neglect. The pages held his thoughts, his words, his silences, things I had never understood fully before. For a long time, I did nothing but breathe and watch the light shift, tracing the patterns it made across the floor. Then I began to read, not hurriedly, not searching for answers. Simply listening to the voice that had been absent, yet always present. Some lines brought tears I did not anticipate. Others made me smile softly, a quiet, knowing smile, like recognizing someone after a long separation. His handwriting held the cadence of his thoughts, deliberate and patient, and I felt him in the spaces between words. I realized that letting go was not about forgetting. It was about creating room for memory, for life, for the possibility of something new. Some things I would keep as anchors, others I would release, allowing them to dissolve like snow into soil. The window rattled slightly in the breeze, and I felt the shift of seasons as if the house itself were breathing alongside me. Change was subtle, gradual, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I rose slowly, taking one last look around the room. Light lingered on the edges of objects I had once feared to touch. Silence now felt companionable, not oppressive. I closed the door gently behind me, the scent of thawed winter still lingering faintly in the air. The hall stretched before me, open, familiar, different. I touched the doorknob one last time, feeling the weight of years in the curve of metal. Outside, the sun broke fully through gray clouds, illuminating the melting snow in bright, wet patches. Footprints from earlier walks glistened, fading under the gentle heat. The world was moving on, slowly, deliberately, like me. I stepped back into the kitchen, hands warm around a mug of tea, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Some things were gone, some remained. Some grief lingered, subtle, patient. And yet, for the first time in a long while, I felt a measure of calm. Acceptance did not erase the past. It did not heal fully. But it reshaped the space in which memory and life could coexist. I watched the snow melt into the earth outside and thought, perhaps change itself is a kind of peace. The room would wait for another day, and I would continue, slowly, deliberately, carrying both memory and release with me. The morning was soft, pale sunlight spilling across the porch boards, wet from overnight drizzle. I stepped outside, the envelope long since folded into the drawer where I kept small. Important things, keys, photographs, a single pressed leaf from last fall. The porch was empty now, no letter, no footsteps but my own. The wind moved through the trees with gentle insistence, carrying the faint smell of thawing earth. I rested my hand on the railing, worn smooth from years of leaning, thinking of the day the envelope had appeared, Arthur Furley's. Even now it felt alive, like a heartbeat paused in the quiet of the world. And I realized, slowly, that absence can change shape, it can soften without disappearing. Inside, the house hummed with familiar sounds, the radiator sighing, the fridge cycling quietly, the floor settling in its age. I moved from room to room with small gestures, brushing dust from a shelf, adjusting a curtain that had fallen slightly. The letter rested among other quiet things, almost invisible: a bookmark, a keychain, a photograph of my son on a summer day I could still feel on my skin. I touched it gently, remembering the weight of it in my hands, the tremor of hope and fear it carried. Outside, the town was awakening to early spring. Snow had receded fully, leaving traces of mud and grass peeking through. Children's voices drifted faintly from the schoolyard down the street, sharp and alive. Life was moving forward, indifferent and patient. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea that had cooled too quickly, listening to the faint scratch of the wind against the window. Memory was present, not oppressive. I could carry it now, gently, like a bundle of small stones, each one significant, but not overwhelming. I thought about the years of waiting, the years of silence, and I wondered what it truly means to keep a memory alive without letting it dominate the present. I walked back to the porch, bare feet cold on the damp wood, tracing the lines of cracks and grooves. The place where the letter had appeared seemed ordinary now, just part of the house's rhythm. Yet I remembered the moment vividly, the snow swirling outside, the hush of winter, the sudden, impossible presence of his words. I leaned against the railing, looking at the yard where the snow had melted completely. The soil was soft, yielding underfoot, footprints from other mornings fading slowly. Half her teeth. I thought of all the steps I had taken here, both literal and metaphorical, through grief, through hope, through the impossible weight of not knowing. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook I had kept during the months of waiting and reading his letters. Each page was a quiet witness, sketches of snow, lists of memories, fragments of thoughts I could not speak aloud. I turned the pages slowly, letting them breathe in my hands. It struck me then how memory, when carried gently, does not crush. It steadies, it accompanies without insisting. I could feel the ache still, but it no longer owned every moment. There was room now for both absence and presence, for both grief and life moving forward. I sat on the steps, notebook in lap, the envelope folded neatly beside me, its edges soft from handling. For the first time in years, I did not need an answer. I did not need closure. The wind stirred the edges of the envelope, lifting slightly before settling. I imagined his voice, distant but familiar, threading through the quiet air. He had left pieces of himself behind, careful and deliberate, like breadcrumbs through the landscape of memory. I realized that the silence, once sharp and suffocating, had changed. It was no longer a void that swallowed me whole. It had become a companion, steady and shared, stretching between him and me, bridging the distance that years could not undo. I thought of all the mornings spent pacing, waiting for footsteps that never came, all the nights spent rereading his words by lamplight, feeling the tremor of hope and fear. Together, I understood now that the letters were not just about him. They were about me, about finding a way to hold both the loss and the life that continued despite it. Memory had transformed from a weight to something I could carry with care. And the silence, once a sharp, isolating thing, now held the shape of connection. I rose slowly, brushing my palms over the wet railing, letting the chill seep through and remind me I was alive. I tucked the envelope carefully into its drawer, alongside other fragments of quiet life. The sun rose higher, catching dew on the grass, glinting in puddles where the snow had melted. The house breathed around me, familiar, altered, a witness to endurance. I stood on the porch for a long moment, letting the wind sweep through my hair, letting the stillness wrap around me. The ache was there, subtle, a reminder of love and loss, but it no longer demanded attention. I looked out at the town, moving forward in its ordinary way. Life was continuing, gentle and relentless. And for the first time I felt I could do the same. The silence remained, but it finally felt shared. I stepped inside, leaving the porch empty, carrying both memory and release with me. And the world waited, patient for what would come next.